My ex-wife stole my sister's boyfriend and now wants to have children with him. My sister is furious. If you'd told me a year ago that my life would turn into a soap opera, I'd have laughed in your face. But here I am, living in a twisted reality show where my ex-wife has stolen my sister's boyfriend, and now she wants to have children with him. To make things even worse, my sister Emily is furious, and I can't blame her. Let me take you back to the beginning. My name's James, and for the most part life was relatively smooth sailing. I was married to Jessica for 5 years before we decided to part ways. It wasn't a bitter divorce, more like a mutual agreement that we'd grown apart. We stayed on friendly terms, or so I thought. Emily, my younger sister, was my rock throughout the divorce. She's always been the fiery one in the family, never afraid to speak her mind or stand up for what she believes in. She was dating Mark, a seemingly decent guy who'd been a steady presence in her life for the past 2 years. They were good together, or at least, they seemed to be. Mark was the kind of guy who could blend into any crowd. He had this easygoing charm that made him likable, though sometimes I felt he lacked a certain depth. Emily, with her vibrant personality and passion, seemed to balance him out. They had plans for the future, moving in together, maybe even marriage. It all seemed perfect. As for Jessica, she stayed in touch after the divorce, though our interactions were mostly casual. She'd occasionally drop by family gatherings, and I didn't mind. After all, we were adults, and holding grudges wasn't my style. Emily welcomed Jessica, treating her like the sister she never had. They got along well, and I thought it was a testament to our maturity that we could all coexist peacefully. One weekend, Emily and Mark invited us over for a small get-together. It was one of those warm summer evenings where everything felt right with the world. We gathered in their backyard with the grill sizzling and laughter filling the air. Jessica was there too, mingling effortlessly as always. Watching her and Emily chat and laugh together, I felt a sense of contentment. It seemed like we had all found a way to move forward. Little did I know that night was the calm before the storm. As the sun set and the stars began to twinkle, I felt a strange unease settle in the pit of my stomach. I brushed it off as remnants of the past surfacing, reminding myself that life was good now, that we were all happy. But that feeling didn't go away. In the weeks that followed, Emily started acting differently. She was more distant, distracted, and there was a flicker of something in her eyes that I couldn't quite place. At first I thought it was just stress from work. Emily had always been ambitious, and her job at the advertising agency was demanding. But this was different. She was pulling away, and I couldn't understand why. One evening I decided to drop by her apartment unannounced, hoping to surprise her with her favorite takeout and maybe get to the bottom of whatever was bothering her. When she opened the door, I could see she had been crying. Her eyes were red, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. "James," she said, her voice trembling, "I need to talk to you." We sat down on her couch, the takeout forgotten on the coffee table. She took a deep breath and started to speak, her words coming out in a rush, like she had been holding them back for far too long. "Jessica and Mark," she said, her voice breaking. They're seeing each other." I stared at her, not comprehending. "What do you mean, seeing each other?" Emily wiped a tear from her cheek. "I found out they've been having an affair. For months, James, months. I don't know what to do." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Jessica and Mark? It didn't make sense. How could they do this to Emily? To me? I wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding, some terrible mistake. But the pain in Emily's eyes told me otherwise. She handed me her phone, and my heart sank as I scrolled through the messages. There it was, clear as day. Flirty texts, secret meetups, and declarations of love. It was like a punch to the gut. I couldn't believe what I was reading. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I was trying to handle it on my own," Emily replied, her voice breaking. "I didn't want to drag you into this mess, but I can't do it alone anymore, James. I need you." I pulled her into a hug, feeling her sob against my shoulder. In that moment, I realized the full extent of the betrayal. My ex-wife and my sister's boyfriend, the people we trusted the most, had torn our world apart. As we sat there, I knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. This was just the beginning of a storm that would change our lives forever. It took a while for Emily to calm down. We sat on her couch, the silence punctuated by her occasional sniffles. My mind raced as I tried to process everything she'd told me. Jessica and Mark. The betrayal felt like a knife twisted in my back. How could they do this? How could they deceive us so completely? Emily pulled away and wiped her eyes, trying to regain some composure. "I'm sorry, James," she said, her voice hoarse. "I didn't want you to find out like this. I thought I could handle it, but it's too much." "Don't apologize, Em," I said, squeezing her hand. "You did the right thing by telling me. We need to figure out what to do next." She nodded, but I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. We both knew that confronting Jessica and Mark wouldn't be easy. But we couldn't let this slide. They needed to face the consequences of their actions. The next day, I called Jessica and asked her to meet me at a cafe we used to frequent. She agreed, probably thinking it was just a friendly catch-up. Little did she know what was coming. When she walked in, she looked as composed and stylish as ever, her dark hair perfectly styled, her smile radiant. Seeing her like that, it was hard to believe she was capable of such betrayal. But the evidence was undeniable. "Hey, James," she said, sitting down across from me. "It's been a while. How have you been?" I forced a smile, trying to keep my emotions in check. "I've been better, Jessica. There's something we need to talk about." Her smile faltered a bit, but she maintained her composure. "Sure, what's on your mind?" I took a deep breath. "I know about you and Mark." For a split second I saw a flicker of panic in her eyes, but she quickly masked it with a look of feigned confusion. "What do you mean?" "Don't play dumb, Jessica," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "I know about the affair. Emily found out everything." Her face went pale, and she looked down at her hands. "James, I didn't mean for it to happen this way." "Then how did you mean for it to happen?" I demanded. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you two went out of your way to deceive us. Emily is devastated, Jessica. How could you do this to her? To me?" She sighed, looking genuinely remorseful for the first time. "I never wanted to hurt anyone. It just happened. Mark and we connected in a way that I never expected. I'm sorry, James. Truly, I am." "Sorry doesn't cut it," I said, my anger bubbling to the surface. "You and Mark have destroyed Emily, and you've put me in an impossible position. How am I supposed to look at either of you the same way again?" Jessica didn't have an answer. She just sat there looking defeated. For the first time, I saw the cracks in her perfect exterior. It didn't make me feel any better. If anything, it made me angrier. How could someone so seemingly put together wreak such havoc on our lives? "I need you to end it," I said, my voice firm. "Whatever you have with Mark, it needs to stop. Emily deserves better than this." "We all do." She nodded slowly, tears welling up in her eyes. "I understand. I'll talk to him." I left the cafe feeling a mix of emotions. Part of me was relieved that Jessica seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, but another part of me was skeptical. Could she really just end things with Mark? Would he even agree to it? The whole situation felt like a ticking time bomb, ready to explode at any moment. That evening, Emily called me. "Did you talk to her?" she asked, her voice strained. "Yeah, I did," I replied. "She said she'll talk to Mark and end things." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Do you think she'll actually do it?" "I hope so," I said, though I wasn't entirely convinced. "But we need to be prepared for whatever comes next, Em. This isn't going to be easy." "I know," she said softly. "Thanks for being there for me, James. I don't know what I'd do without you. You'll never have to find out, I promised. We'll get through this together. The next few days were a blur of tension and uncertainty. Emily and I tried to carry on with our lives, but the shadow of Jessica and Mark's betrayal loomed over us. Emily took some time off work, needing the space to process everything. I checked in on her constantly, making sure she was okay. Then, one afternoon, Emily called me in tears again. "He's not ending it," she sobbed. "Mark said he can't just stop seeing her. He thinks they're in love." I felt my blood boil. How could Mark be so selfish, so blind to the pain he was causing? I knew then that this was far from over. Jessica and Mark had made their choice, and it was up to us to decide how to respond. "Stay put, Em," I said, grabbing my keys. "I'm coming over. We're going to figure this out." When I arrived at Emily's place, she looked more broken than I'd ever seen her. We sat down together and she told me everything Mark had said. It was clear he had no intention of ending things with Jessica. He was willing to throw away everything he had with Emily for a chance with my ex-wife. "We need to confront them together," I said, feeling a surge of determination. "They can't just walk all over us like this. They need to see the damage they've done." Emily nodded, wiping her tears. "You're right. We can't let them get away with this." We planned to meet with Jessica and Mark that weekend. It would be a showdown of sorts, a chance for us to demand answers and hopefully find some closure. As the day approached, I felt a mix of dread and resolve. This was the moment we'd been dreading, but it was also our chance to take control of the situation. The day of the confrontation arrived, and Emily and I drove to the park where we'd agreed to meet. It was a neutral place, away from the suffocating walls of our homes. As we pulled into the parking lot, we saw Jessica and Mark waiting by a bench. They looked tense, like they knew a storm was coming. We walked over and I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on us. Emily stood beside me, her jaw set in determination. Jessica and Mark stood up as we approached, their faces a mix of guilt and apprehension. "Let's get this over with," I said, my voice steady. "We need to talk." And talk we did. It was a raw, emotional confrontation, filled with accusations, confessions, and pleas for understanding. Emily poured out her heart, demanding to know how they could betray her like this. Jessica tried to explain, but her words felt hollow. Mark looked torn, but his loyalty to Jessica was clear. As the confrontation dragged on, it became clear that there were no easy answers. The damage had been done, and no amount of apologies could fix it. But at least we had confronted the truth, faced it head-on. As we left the park that day, I felt a strange sense of relief. The storm was far from over, but at least we were no longer in the dark. We knew where we stood, and now it was up to us to navigate the turbulent waters ahead. The drive back from the park was silent, the weight of our confrontation pressing down on us. Emily stared out the window, her eyes red from crying, while I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white. We had faced Jessica and Mark, but it didn't feel like a victory. The betrayal was still fresh, and the road to healing seemed impossibly long. When we got back to Emily's apartment, we collapsed onto the couch, the exhaustion of the past few days catching up with us. Emily leaned her head on my shoulder, and we sat there in silence, the reality of the situation settling in. "What's next, James?" she asked softly. "How do we move on from this?" I sighed, wishing I had an easy answer. "One step at a time, Em. We'll figure it out together. For now, let's focus on taking care of ourselves." That night I decided to stay over at Emily's place. She needed the support, and I didn't want to leave her alone. We ordered takeout, trying to find some semblance of normalcy in the midst of the chaos. But even as we ate and tried to distract ourselves with a movie, the weight of what had happened lingered in the air. The next morning we woke up to a barrage of text messages and missed calls from our parents. It seemed the news of Jessica and Mark's affair had spread like wildfire, and our parents were demanding answers. With a deep breath I called them back, bracing myself for the inevitable fallout. "James, what is going on?" my mother demanded as soon as she picked up. We've been hearing all sorts of things, and Emily hasn't been answering her phone. Are you both okay?" "We're managing, Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's true. Jessica and Mark, they were having an affair. Emily found out, and it's been a mess ever since." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "How could this happen?" she finally said, her voice trembling. "How could they do this to us? To Emily?" "I don't know, Mom," I admitted, feeling the frustration rise within me. "But we need to support Emily right now. She needs us." "We'll be there soon," my father said, taking the phone from my mother. "Stay strong, son. We'll get through this together." When our parents arrived later that day, the emotions ran high. My mother hugged Emily tightly, her tears mixing with my sister's. My father, always the stoic one, put a reassuring hand on my shoulder. It was a small comfort, but in that moment, it meant everything. We spent the afternoon talking, trying to make sense of the situation. My parents were furious with Jessica and Mark, their disappointment palpable. But their primary concern was Emily, and they rallied around her, offering their unwavering support. As the days turned into weeks, the fallout from the affair continued to ripple through our lives. Family gatherings became tense and awkward, with Jessica's absence glaringly obvious. Mark, too, was nowhere to be seen, having retreated into his own corner of shame. It felt like a dark cloud hung over us, and the once close-knit family we had known was now fractured. Emily struggled to regain her footing. She threw herself into her work, using it as a distraction from the pain. But I could see the toll it was taking on her. She was a shell of her former self, her vibrant personality dimmed by the betrayal. It broke my heart to see her like this, and I did everything I could to be there for her. One evening, as we sat in her apartment, she turned to me, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and sorrow. "I don't understand how they could do this, James. How could they be so selfish?" "I wish I had an answer for you," I said, feeling the frustration build. "But some people just don't think about the consequences of their actions. They only care about what they want in the moment." Emily nodded, her jaw set in determination. "Well, they're not going to get away with it. I won't let them." Her words hung in the air, a promise of retribution. I knew Emily well enough to understand that she wasn't one to let things slide. She was planning something, and while part of me was worried about where her anger might lead her, another part of me wanted to see Jessica and Mark face the consequences of their actions. As we navigated the emotional minefield of our new reality, I found myself reflecting on my own feelings about Jessica. She had been my wife once, someone I had trusted and cared for deeply, and now she was at the center of this storm, having betrayed not only me but my sister as well. It was a lot to process, and I wasn't sure if I could ever forgive her. One afternoon, I decided to visit Jessica. I needed closure, a chance to understand her side of the story. I found her at her new apartment, looking worn and tired. She seemed surprised to see me, but she let me in, her eyes wary. "James," she said quietly, "I didn't expect to see you." "I needed to talk to you," I replied, taking a seat across from her. "I need to understand why. Why did you do it, Jessica? Why Mark?" She looked down, her fingers nervously twisting a strand of her hair. "I don't know if I can give you a satisfying answer," she said finally. "I never meant for it to happen this way. I never wanted to hurt anyone, but Mark and we just connected. It felt right, even though I knew it was wrong." Her words did little to ease the ache in my heart. "You had to know how much this would hurt, Emily, how much it would hurt me." "I know," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "And I'm so sorry. But I can't change what happened. All I can do is try to move forward." I sighed, feeling a mix of anger and pity. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you, Jessica, but for Emily's sake, you need to stay away from Mark. She's been through enough." She nodded, her tears spilling over. "I understand. I'll stay away, I promise." As I left her apartment, I felt a sense of finality. Jessica had made her choices, and now we all had to live with the consequences. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was time to focus on the future. Back at Emily's place, we continued to support each other, trying to find a new normal. Our parents remained a constant presence, their love and support a beacon of hope in the midst of the chaos. It wasn't easy, but we were determined to get through this together. One evening, Emily and I sat on her balcony, watching the sunset. It was a rare moment of peace, a chance to reflect on everything that had happened. "We're going to be okay, James," she said softly, her hand resting on mine. "It's going to take time, but we'll get through this." I squeezed her hand, feeling a sense of solidarity. "Yes, we will, one step at a time." As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a glimmer of hope. The storm wasn't over, but we were weathering it together, and that, I realized, was what mattered most. Life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. Just as Emily and I started to find a semblance of normalcy amidst the chaos, Jessica dropped another bombshell that turned our world upside down once again. It had been a few weeks since our confrontation at the park, and although things were far from perfect, Emily was starting to heal. She focused on her work, spent time with supportive friends, and we found moments of solace in our family's unwavering support. I, too, tried to move forward, throwing myself into work and being there for Emily whenever she needed me. One quiet Saturday morning, my phone buzzed with a message from Jessica. Seeing her name on the screen sent a jolt of anxiety through me. We hadn't spoken since our last conversation, and I had hoped it would stay that way. Reluctantly, I opened the message. "Jessica, James, I need to talk to you. It's important." I sighed, debating whether to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore her, to let her deal with her own mess, but curiosity and a sense of obligation got the better of me. "What is it, Jessica?" Her reply was almost immediate. "Jessica, can we meet? I'd rather talk in person." Against my better judgment, I agreed. We arranged to meet at a quiet cafe downtown, a neutral place where we could talk without causing a scene. As I walked to the cafe, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in my stomach. When I arrived, Jessica was already there, looking more anxious than I'd ever seen her. She stood up as I approached, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "James, thank you for meeting me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Just tell me what's going on," I replied, trying to keep my tone even. She took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly together. "I'm pregnant." For a moment I was too stunned to speak. "Pregnant?" My mind raced, trying to process the implications. Jessica and Mark were expecting a child. This wasn't just about an affair anymore. This was about a life that would forever tie them together. "James, please say something," Jessica pleaded, her eyes searching mine. I shook my head, struggling to find my voice. "How far along are you?" "About 2 months," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. 2 months. That meant she had been pregnant when Emily found out about the affair. The betrayal cut even deeper now, knowing that Jessica and Mark had created a life amidst the lies and deceit. "What are you going to do?" I asked, my voice hollow. Jessica's eyes filled with tears. "Mark and I have decided to keep the baby. We want to try and make things work for the sake of our child." I felt a surge of anger and frustration. They had destroyed Emily's happiness, torn our family apart, and now they wanted to play happy family for the sake of their unborn child. It felt like a cruel twist of fate. "Have you told Emily?" I asked, dreading the answer. Jessica shook her head. "Not yet. I wanted to tell you first. I thought you should know before anyone else." I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions raging inside me. "You need to tell her, Jessica. She deserves to know the truth." "I know," she said, her voice breaking. "I just don't know how to tell her without hurting her even more." "There's no way to do that," I said bluntly. "But she needs to hear it from you, not from someone else." Jessica nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'll tell her, I promise." As I walked away from the cafe, I felt a mix of anger, sadness, and helplessness. Jessica and Mark's decision to keep the baby added another layer of complexity to an already painful situation. I couldn't imagine how Emily would react to the news, and the thought of seeing her hurt again made my heart ache. When I got back to Emily's apartment, she was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She looked up and smiled when she saw me, but her smile faded when she saw the expression on my face. "James, what's wrong?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. I sat down beside her, taking her hand in mine. "Em, we need to talk. It's about Jessica." Her eyes narrowed, and I could see the worry in her eyes. "What did she do now?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I had to say. "She's pregnant." Emily's face went pale, and she pulled her hand away from mine. "Pregnant? Are you serious?" I nodded, feeling the weight of the words. "She and Mark are planning to keep the baby." For a moment, Emily was silent, her expression a mix of shock and disbelief. Then her face contorted with anger. "How could they do this? How could they bring a child into this mess?" "I don't know," I said quietly. "But they've made their decision. Jessica said she's going to tell you herself." Emily stood up, pacing the room as she tried to process the news. "This is unbelievable. First they betray me, and now they expect me to be okay with this?" "You don't have to be okay with it, Em," I said, standing up to face her, "but we need to figure out how to move forward for your sake." She looked at me, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know if I can do this, James. It's too much." I pulled her into a hug, feeling her body tremble with emotion. "We'll get through this, Em, one step at a time. You're not alone." The days that followed were a blur of emotions. Emily tried to stay strong, but the news of Jessica's pregnancy weighed heavily on her. Our parents were equally shocked and outraged when they found out, their anger towards Jessica and Mark intensifying. Jessica finally mustered the courage to tell Emily in person. I was there to support my sister, bracing myself for the emotional fallout. When Jessica arrived, she looked nervous, her eyes red from crying. "Emily, I know this is hard," Jessica began, her voice trembling. "But I need to tell you something. I'm pregnant." Emily's reaction was immediate and visceral. "How could you do this?" she shouted, tears streaming down her face. "How could you bring a child into this mess after everything you've done?" "I'm so sorry, Emily," Jessica sobbed. "Mark and we didn't plan this, but we want to make it work for the baby's sake." Emily shook her head, her anger giving way to sorrow. "You've destroyed everything. My relationship, our family. And now you expect me to be okay with this?" "I don't expect you to be okay," Jessica said, her voice breaking. "But I hope in time you can find it in your heart to forgive us for the baby's sake." Emily turned away, her shoulders shaking with sobs. I stepped forward, putting a protective arm around her. "Jessica, you've done enough damage. I think it's best if you leave." Jessica nodded, tears streaming down her face as she left the apartment. The door closed behind her, and Emily collapsed into my arms, her body racked with sobs. In the weeks that followed, Emily and I tried to navigate this new reality. The news of Jessica's pregnancy had added a new layer of complexity to an already painful situation. Emily struggled with the idea of her ex-boyfriend and my ex-wife raising a child together, and I did my best to support her through it all. One evening, as we sat on the couch, Emily turned to me with a determined look in her eyes. "I'm not going to let them get away with this, James. They need to face the consequences of their actions." "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling a pang of worry. "I have a plan," she said, her voice steady. "It's time to take action." As she outlined her plan, I felt a mix of concern and admiration. Emily was hurt and angry, but she was also determined to reclaim her power and make Jessica and Mark face the consequences of their betrayal. The storm was far from over, but one thing was clear: Emily was not going to go down without a fight, and I would be right there by her side, ready to support her every step of the way. The revelation of Jessica's pregnancy had deepened the wound, but it also ignited a fierce determination in Emily. Her heartbreak had given way to anger, and she was ready to take control of the situation. I watched as she channeled her pain into planning her revenge, driven by a desire to make Jessica and Mark face the consequences of their actions. Emily's plan was bold and calculated. It wasn't just about getting back at them, It was about reclaiming her sense of self-worth and showing them that they couldn't trample over her life without repercussions. As her brother, I had mixed feelings about her plan, but I understood her need for closure and justice. One evening, as we sat at her dining table, she laid out her strategy. "James, I've thought this through. It's not just about revenge. It's about making sure they understand the gravity of what they've done." I nodded, listening intently. "What do you have in mind?" Emily took a deep breath, her eyes burning with resolve. "I'm going to expose them, publicly. They've been so concerned with keeping their affair a secret, with maintaining their perfect image. I'm going to take that away from them." Her plan was to reveal the affair and the pregnancy at a large family gathering. Our extended family was planning a reunion, and it was the perfect opportunity to lay everything bare. Emily wanted everyone to know the truth, to see Jessica and Mark for who they really were. "Emily, are you sure about this?" I asked, my voice tinged with concern. "Once you do this, there's no going back." She nodded firmly. "I'm sure, James. They need to face the consequences of their actions, and I need closure. This is the only way." As the day of the reunion approached, Emily and I prepared for the fallout. She gathered the evidence she had, the text messages, the photos, everything that proved their betrayal. I stood by her side, ready to support her through the storm. The reunion was held at our grandparents' house, a sprawling property that always seemed to bring our family together. There were tables laden with food, children running around, and adults catching up on each other's lives. It was the perfect setting for Emily's plan, though the thought of what was to come made my stomach churn. Jessica and Mark arrived separately, maintaining the facade of normalcy. Mark tried to avoid eye contact with us, while Jessica put on a brave face, mingling with relatives as if nothing was wrong. Emily and I waited for the right moment, biding our time until everyone was gathered. When it was time for speeches, Emily stepped forward, her hands shaking slightly as she took the microphone. She glanced at me, and I gave her an encouraging nod. This was her moment. "Hello, everyone," she began, her voice steadying as she spoke. "I'm so glad we could all be here today. Family is important, and it's gatherings like this that remind us of the bonds we share." There were nods and murmurs of agreement from the crowd. Jessica and Mark stood off to the side, their expressions neutral. "But sometimes," Emily continued, her voice growing stronger, "those bonds are tested. Sometimes people we trust betray us in ways we could never imagine." The room grew quiet, a sense of unease settling over the gathering. Emily took a deep breath, her eyes locking onto Jessica and Mark. "I'm talking about betrayal," she said, her voice unwavering. "I found out a few months ago that my boyfriend Mark and my brother's ex-wife Jessica were having an affair." Gasps and whispers rippled through the crowd. Jessica's face went pale, and Mark looked like he wanted to disappear. Emily held up her phone, scrolling through the incriminating messages. "Here's the proof," she said, her voice filled with a mix of pain and determination. "They lied to me, to my brother, and to all of us, and now they're expecting a child together." The shock was palpable. Our relatives looked from Jessica to Mark, their expressions a mix of disbelief and anger. Jessica tried to step forward, but Emily cut her off. "Don't," Emily said sharply. "You've done enough damage." Tears streamed down Jessica's face as she stood frozen, unable to defend herself. Mark looked around, his face contorted with guilt and shame. The weight of their actions had finally caught up with them, and there was no escaping the judgment of our family. The reunion descended into chaos. Relatives approached Emily and me, offering their support and expressing their outrage at Jessica and Mark's betrayal. Our parents were furious, confronting Jessica and demanding answers. It was a cathartic moment for Emily, a release of all the pent-up anger and hurt she had been carrying. As the dust settled, I pulled Emily aside. "You did it, Em. You stood up for yourself." She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I needed to, James. I needed them to know that they couldn't just walk all over us. We left the reunion, the echoes of the confrontation still ringing in our ears. It wasn't a perfect solution, and it didn't erase the pain, but it was a step towards healing. Emily had reclaimed her power, and I was proud of her for standing up for herself. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from the reunion continued. Jessica and Mark became pariahs within the family, their actions condemned by everyone. They tried to make amends, but the damage was too deep. Their relationship was strained, the weight of their betrayal and the impending arrival of their child hanging over them. Emily, on the other hand, began to heal. The act of exposing Jessica and Mark had been a cathartic release for her, a way to confront the pain head-on. She threw herself into her work, surrounded herself with supportive friends, and started to rebuild her life. One evening, as we sat on her balcony watching the sunset, she turned to me with a small smile. "Thank you for standing by me, James. I couldn't have done it without you." I squeezed her hand, feeling a sense of pride and relief. "We're in this together, Em, always." As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a glimmer of hope. The storm had been fierce, but we had weathered it together. And in the aftermath we had found a new strength, a renewed bond that would carry us through whatever came next. The family reunion had been explosive, but it didn't bring the closure Emily had hoped for. Instead, it had left a wake of unresolved emotions and lingering tensions. Emily was still angry, still hurt, and determined to get the closure she deserved. A few days after the reunion, Emily decided it was time for a more direct confrontation with Jessica and Mark. She wanted to face them in a more controlled setting, where she could express her feelings without the chaos of a large crowd. She called them both, arranging a meeting at our parents' house. They reluctantly agreed, knowing they couldn't avoid this forever. The atmosphere was tense as we waited for Jessica and Mark to arrive. Our parents were supportive, but they were also exhausted by the ongoing drama. Emily paced the living room, her emotions bubbling just beneath the surface. When Jessica and Mark finally walked in, the tension in the room was palpable. They looked nervous, their faces etched with guilt and apprehension. Emily stood up, her eyes locked onto them with a steely determination. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice surprisingly calm. "I wanted to talk to you both without the noise and distractions. We need to clear the air." Jessica nodded, tears already welling up in her eyes. "Emily, we're so sorry. We never wanted to hurt you." "But you did," Emily shot back, her voice breaking slightly. "You hurt me more than I ever thought possible. And now, you're bringing a child into this mess. How do you expect me to deal with that?" Mark stepped forward, his expression earnest. "We know we've made terrible mistakes, Emily. We're trying to make things right, but we understand if you can't forgive us." "Forgiveness isn't something you can just ask for," Emily replied, her anger rising. "You have to earn it. And right now, I don't see how that's possible. You betrayed my trust, you destroyed my relationship, and now you're asking me to accept your new life together." Jessica sobbed quietly, her shoulders shaking. "We love each other, Emily. We didn't plan for this to happen, but it did. And now we have to live with the consequences." Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady her emotions. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you, but for the sake of your child, I hope you find a way to be better people, to make sure they never feel the kind of pain you've caused me." Mark nodded, his eyes filled with regret. "We'll do our best, Emily. We owe you that much." The confrontation was intense, raw, and filled with emotion. But it was also necessary. Emily needed to face them, to express her pain and anger directly. It was a step towards healing, even if the road ahead was still uncertain. As Jessica and Mark left, Emily collapsed into my arms, exhausted but relieved. "I needed that," she whispered. "I needed them to understand how much they've hurt me." "You did great, Em," I said, holding her tightly. "You stood up for yourself. That's what matters." In the aftermath of the confrontation, Emily began to find some semblance of peace. She knew the pain wouldn't disappear overnight, But she also knew she was stronger than she had ever realized, and with the support of her family, she was ready to face whatever came next. In the wake of Emily's confrontation with Jessica and Mark, the dust began to settle, but the consequences of their actions continued to ripple through our lives. The family remained divided, and the tension was palpable at every gathering. Despite the anger and betrayal, life had to move forward, and Emily and I focused on rebuilding our lives amidst the chaos. One morning, as we were having coffee at Emily's apartment, she received an unexpected call from her boss. Her face paled as she listened, and when she hung up, she looked at me with a mix of shock and disbelief. "James, my boss just offered me a promotion," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They want me to head the new branch in Chicago." My heart leaped with both excitement and trepidation. "That's amazing, Em. But what do you think?" Emily took a deep breath, her eyes reflecting the internal struggle she was facing. "It's a huge opportunity, but it means leaving everything here behind. I don't know if I'm ready for that." We spent the day discussing the pros and cons of the move. It was clear that the promotion was a fantastic career opportunity, a chance for Emily to start fresh away from the painful memories. But it also meant leaving behind the support system that had helped her through the darkest times. Meanwhile, the situation with Jessica and Mark continued to evolve. Jessica's pregnancy was becoming more noticeable, and with it came a new set of challenges. The family was still grappling with the betrayal, and the impending arrival of their child added another layer of complexity. One evening, as Emily and I were having dinner, there was a knock on the door. I opened it to find Mark standing there, looking more disheveled than I had ever seen him. He looked desperate, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and guilt. "Can I talk to you both?" he asked, his voice cracking. "I know I'm the last person you want to see, but I need your help." We hesitated but let him in, curious and wary of what he had to say. He sat down, his hands trembling as he spoke. "Jessica's been having complications with the pregnancy," he said, his voice filled with despair. "We need help, emotional support. I know we don't deserve it, but I'm begging you for the sake of the baby." Emily and I exchanged glances, the weight of the request hanging heavily in the air. Despite everything, there was an innocent life involved now, a child who hadn't asked to be born into this mess. Emily's expression softened slightly, but I could see the conflict in her eyes. "Mark, you've put us in an impossible position," Emily said quietly. "But we can't ignore that there's an innocent child involved. We'll help, but this doesn't mean we forgive you." Mark nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you. That means more than you know." In the weeks that followed, Emily and I found ourselves reluctantly supporting Jessica and Mark through the complications of the pregnancy. It was a strange and uncomfortable situation, but we focused on the well-being of the baby, putting our personal feelings aside. Emily's decision about the promotion weighed heavily on her mind. She knew that taking the job in Chicago would offer her a fresh start, but she also felt a sense of responsibility to the family and the unborn child. As she grappled with her decision, I stood by her, ready to support her no matter what she chose. One afternoon, as we sat on the balcony overlooking the city, Emily turned to me, her eyes filled with resolve. "James, I think I'm going to take the promotion. I need to start over, away from all this pain." I nodded, feeling a mix of pride and sadness. "I understand, Em. You deserve a fresh start. Just know that I'll always be here for you, no matter where you are." As she prepared for her move to Chicago, we both felt a sense of bittersweet closure. The storm of betrayal had brought us closer together, and despite the unintended consequences, we had found a way to navigate through the pain. Emily's decision to start anew was a testament to her strength and resilience, and I knew that she would thrive in her new life. The days leading up to Emily's departure were a whirlwind of packing, farewells, and mixed emotions. It was hard to believe that she was leaving for Chicago, ready to embrace a new chapter in her life. As we loaded the last of her boxes into the moving truck, I felt a profound sense of pride. Emily had come so far, overcoming incredible pain and betrayal, and was now ready to take on the world. On her last night in town, we had a small family dinner. It was bittersweet, knowing this would be the last time we'd all be together for a while. Our parents were emotional but supportive, understanding that this was the best step for Emily. We laughed, reminisced about old times, and promised to visit each other as often as possible. Early the next morning, I drove Emily to the airport. The ride was filled with a comfortable silence, both of us lost in our thoughts. When we arrived, she turned to me with a smile, though her eyes were glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you, James, for everything," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't have gotten through this without you." I hugged her tightly, feeling my own eyes grow wet. "You're stronger than you know, Em. You're going to do amazing things in Chicago, and I'll always be here for you, no matter what." We said our final goodbyes, and I watched her walk through the airport gates, a mixture of sadness and hope swelling in my chest. As I drove back home, I reflected on everything that had happened over the past few months. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the confrontations, and now, the fresh start. It had been a tumultuous journey, but we had come out stronger on the other side. Back at home, life slowly returned to a new kind of normal. Jessica and Mark welcomed their baby, a little girl named Lily. The birth brought a strange sense of peace to the family, a reminder that life goes on and new beginnings are always possible. Emily and I stayed in touch regularly, video calling each other often. She was thriving in Chicago, finding new friends, and excelling in her new role. It was clear that the move had been the right choice for her, and I couldn't have been happier. One sunny afternoon, as I sat on the balcony with a cup of coffee, I received a text from Jessica. It was a picture of Lily, bundled up and sleeping peacefully. Underneath, she had written, "Thank you for helping us, despite everything. We're trying to be better people for her." I stared at the picture for a long time, feeling a mix of emotions. The anger and betrayal were still there, but they were beginning to fade, replaced by a cautious hope for the future. Jessica and Mark were making an effort to be better, and while forgiveness was still a long way off, I could see a path forward. As the months passed, I found myself reflecting on the lessons learned from this ordeal. It had taught me about resilience, the importance of family, and the power of forgiveness. It had shown me that even in the darkest times, there is always a way to find light and hope. One evening, as the sun set over the city, I received a call from Emily. She sounded happier than ever, her voice filled with excitement as she told me about her latest adventures in Chicago. Hearing her so content made everything we had gone through feel worth it. "James, I've met someone," she said, her voice tinged with joy. "His name is Alex, and he's wonderful. I can't wait for you to meet him." I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through my chest. "I'm so happy for you, Em. You deserve all the happiness in the world." As I hung up the phone, I looked out at the city skyline, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. Life had thrown us some brutal challenges, but we had faced them head-on and come out stronger. Emily was finding her happiness, and so was I. The story of Jessica, Mark, Emily, and me was far from a fairy tale. It was messy, painful, and filled with unexpected twists. But it was also a story of resilience, growth, and the unbreakable bond of family. And as we all moved forward, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together, stronger than ever before. In the end, it wasn't just about the betrayal or the pain. It was about finding the strength to rebuild, to forgive, and to embrace new beginnings. And as the sun set on this chapter of our lives, I felt a profound sense of peace, ready to welcome whatever the future had in store.